In August 636 CE, on the rugged plains of the Yarmouk River Valley, along the modern border of Syria and Jordan, an Eastern Roman army of over 40,000 men was methodically eradicated. This catastrophic defeat stripped the imperial government of the Levant and permanently shifted the balance of global power. The tragedy was rooted in a bitter military paradox. Emperor Heraclius had just spent decades exhausting the imperial treasury to save his realm from the Sassanid Persians, only to watch his veteran heavy infantry get trapped and dismantled by a much smaller, highly mobile force from the Arabian Peninsula. The Rashidun Vanguard did not merely outmaneuver the disciplined Roman ranks. They weaponized the steep ravines of the local geography and the blinding, abrasive grit of the Khamsin wind to engineer a total collapse of imperial command. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today we break down the fatal command errors, the trap of the Wadis, and the blinding dust that broke the Roman Empire in the East. To understand how an imperial field army could be so utterly annihilated, one must look not at the month of the battle, but at the 3 decades of brutal attrition that preceded it. By the early 630s CE, the Eastern Roman Empire was a depleted structure, drained of both manpower and resources. Emperor Heraclius had just concluded the devastating 26-year Byzantine Sassanid War in 628 CE, a conflict of massive scale that had pushed the state to the absolute brink of collapse. Though Heraclius secured a legendary Pyrrhic victory, reclaiming lost territories from the Persians, the triumph was an illusion of security. The imperial treasury was entirely bankrupt. To finance the counteroffensives, the government in Constantinople had resorted to stripping church silver and taking ruinous loans. The logistical reality on the eastern frontiers was catastrophic. Across the Levant, the Syrian frontier towns stood in heavy, hollowed-out silence, their defensive walls crumbling and their populations severely depleted by plague, prolonged Persian occupation, and forced deportations. Paying regular wages to the remaining frontier garrisons was nearly impossible, forcing the imperial administration to cut subsidies to the Ghassanid Arab client states that had traditionally guarded the desert approaches. It was at this exact moment of maximum structural vulnerability that a completely new political and military force erupted from the Arabian Peninsula. Following the rise of Islam, the scattered and fiercely independent Arabian tribes had been forged into a unified expansionist state under the Rashidun Caliphate. The court at Constantinople fundamentally misunderstood the nature of this rising power. Imperial intelligence initially dismissed the incoming Rashidun forces as mere nomadic raiding parties seeking temporary plunder, rather than an organized military prosecuting a war of permanent conquest. When the Arab vanguard began systematically dismantling the underfunded Roman border defenses and seizing vital logistical hubs like Damascus, the severe reality of the situation finally reached Heraclius. The empire was not facing a localized border skirmish. It was facing a coordinated invasion, while its military infrastructure was still paralyzed from the Persian wars. To secure his fragile, newly reclaimed provinces and drive the invaders back into the deep desert, Heraclius realized that piecemeal defense was futile. He required a decisive, overwhelming show of imperial force, drawing on the very last reserves of the empire, stripping the Balkans and Anatolia of their veteran defenders, and hiring vast numbers of allied troops. The emperor assembled one of the largest imperial armies the 7th century had ever seen. He ordered this massive coalition south to decisively crush the Rashidun forces, entirely unaware that he was sending them directly into a geographical prison. Commanding this massive imperial coalition were Vahan, an Armenian general of formidable reputation, and Theodore Trytherius, the imperial treasurer, acting as supreme commander. Under their banners marched a staggering force of 40,000 to 80,000 men. a complex and multi-ethnic assembly of regular heavy infantry, elite cataphract cavalry, seasoned Armenian regiments, and allied Ghassanid Arab light horsemen. Opposing them stood the Rashidun army of approximately 20,000 to 40,000 troops, commanded by Khaled ibn al-Walid, a cavalry commander and tactician who had never lost a pitched battle. This numerical disparity masked a fundamental doctrinal clash between two entirely different philosophies of warfare. The heavily armored, methodical discipline of the traditional Roman military machine versus the highly mobile, stamina-driven shock tactics of a unified desert vanguard. The Roman strategy relied entirely on structural mass and defensive cohesion. Their tactical doctrine dictated the assembly of deep infantry blocks designed to absorb enemy charges, grind down opposing momentum, and allow the heavy cavalry to strike decisively at the flanks. As the Imperial Vanguard deployed on the arid plains, the immense visual weight of 40,000 regular troops locking into rigid grid formations was accompanied by the mechanical, rhythmic clatter of thousands of overlapping iron scales and heavy shields. However, this formidable physical structure was severely compromised by deep political and ethnic fractures within the command hierarchy. Authority was divided awkwardly between Vahan, Theodore, and several regional commanders, resulting in a cumbersome and highly politicized chain of communication. In the face of a rapidly developing battlefield, the Roman High Command required time to reach consensus, a fatal structural flaw when fighting an enemy that operated entirely on speed. In stark contrast, the Rashidun forces operated under the absolute undisputed authority of Khaled. There were no competing generals or bureaucratic delays in his camp. His orders were executed instantaneously, allowing the entire army to pivot as a single organism. Recognizing that his lighter infantry could not win a prolonged static pushing match against Roman shield walls, Khaled structured his army for maximum fluidity. He divided his light cavalry into highly mobile reserve squadrons, keeping them out of the initial clashes so they could rapidly plug gaps in his own lines or exploit sudden weaknesses in the enemy's formation. Furthermore, the Arab troops were accustomed to fighting in extreme heat and covering vast distances with minimal logistical support, granting them a level of operational endurance that the heavily encumbered Imperial regular troops simply could not match. If the two armies had clashed on an endless flat plain, the sheer mass, armor, and technological superiority of the Roman heavy infantry would likely have crushed the Muslim center through pure attritional weight. Vahan understood this advantage and intended to force exactly that kind of traditional grinding engagement, using his overlapping lines to envelop the smaller army and cut off their retreat. But numbers and armor meant nothing without space to maneuver, and Khaled had already chosen the exact terrain where the Romans' numerical advantage would become their executioner. The Yarmouk River Valley presented a highly deceptive topography that fundamentally dictated the outcome of the campaign. To the Imperial command, the wide expanse of the plateau initially appeared to be ideal ground for deploying their massive infantry blocks. Vahan accepted battle here because the flat terrain seemed capable of supporting his overlapping lines and heavy cataphracts. Yet, the edges of this plain hid a lethal geographical feature. To the west and rear of the Roman positions plunged the Wadi al-Rukad, a deep, sheer-sided ravine carving precipitously through the landscape. As the Imperial regular troops assembled, the intense, oppressive August heat radiated directly from the sun-baked volcanic rock, slowly draining the stamina of the heavily armored infantry before a single order to advance was even issued. Vahan established his primary camp strategically, attempting to secure the vital Roman road leading north to Damascus, which served as his sole logistical artery. He deliberately anchored his right flank and rear against the steep drop of the Wadi al-Rukad. In standard Roman military doctrine, securing a flank against an impassable natural barrier is a textbook defensive measure intended to prevent cavalry encirclement. However, the Imperial commanders failed to recognize how this orthodox decision fundamentally compromised their operational mobility. Khaled ibn al-Walid immediately identified the fatal flaw in the Roman deployment, an impassable obstacle that secures a flank against an enemy charge also completely severs any avenue of organized retreat if the defending army is forced backward. Instead of launching an immediate assault, Khaled exercised profound strategic patience, effectively utilizing the harsh environment to degrade the enemy command's options. He positioned his smaller, agile forces to block the Roman advance while refusing to commit to a decisive engagement. This tactical standoff placed immense logistical pressure entirely on Vahan and his subordinate commanders. Supplying a centralized force of up to 80,000 men and their mounts in the arid Syrian summer required a massive daily influx of grain and water. As Rashidun light cavalry continuously harassed the Imperial supply lines stretching back toward Damascus, the Roman High Command quickly realized they could not afford a prolonged war of attrition. The sheer material cost of maintaining their concentrated army forced their hand. Khaled's geographical positioning thus dictated the terms of the engagement. By simply holding his ground and leveraging the restrictive terrain, he forced the Imperial army into a position where they had to initiate the attack, knowing their heavy infantry would have to advance against his prepared defenses. The geographical trap was fully laid, expertly disguised to the Roman generals as a secure defensive anchor. The battlefield was set, and for the first 4 days, the Imperial army would push the Rashidun lines to the absolute breaking point. When Vahan finally ordered the general advance, the Imperial military machine demonstrated exactly why it had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. The Roman battle line, stretching for miles across the plateau, moved forward with a methodical, terrifying discipline. The rhythmic, a mechanical sound of tens of thousands of Roman infantry marching in unison, their heavy shields locking together under the scorching desert sun, signaled the beginning of a relentless attritional push. Vahan's strategy was not complex. He intended to use his overwhelming numerical superiority to grind the Rashidun forces into the dust through sheer physical pressure. For the first 2 days, this orthodox approach yielded severe results. The heavily armored Roman vanguard absorbed the initial Arab missile fire and crashed into the Muslim center and flanks, initiating a brutal close-quarters stalemate that tested the physical limits of both armies. By the 2nd and 3rd days, the immense weight of the Roman numbers began to fracture the Rashidun lines. Vahan concentrated his heavy cataphracts and elite Armenian regiments on the Muslim flanks, successfully breaking through the Arab left and right. Stripped of their momentum and taking heavy casualties, sectors of the Rashidun infantry began to collapse, falling back in disarray toward their central encampments. It was here that a unique social and psychological dynamic saved the Muslim army from total rout. As the retreating soldiers reached their tents, they were met not with sanctuary, but by the women of the camp. Armed with dismantled tent poles and stones, the women violently repelled their own men, fiercely shaming the retreating veterans and physically driving them back toward the Roman swords. This extreme psychological pressure stabilized the broken units, forcing them to turn and re-engage the pursuing Imperial troops. Yet, a psychological resilience alone could not stop the Roman heavy infantry. It required Khaled ibn al-Walid's exceptional command and control. Unlike the Roman High Command, which remained static and relied on slow sequential relay systems to issue orders across their massive front, Khaled operated dynamically. He commanded a centralized elite mobile guard, a rapid response cavalry reserve kept strictly out of the initial infantry clashes. Whenever a sector of his line buckled under the Roman advance, Khaled personally led this cavalry force to the exact point of crisis. Striking the exposed flanks of the advancing Roman cohorts, his mobile guard shattered the Imperial momentum, forcing the Romans to halt and defend themselves. This rapid tactical intervention bought crucial time for the rallied Arab infantry to reform their shield walls. This localized high-speed counterpunching exposed the fatal flaw in Vahan's rigid hierarchy. The Roman commanders could successfully punch holes in the Arab defense, but their command structure was too slow and cumbersome to exploit those breakthroughs before Khaled's cavalry sealed the breach. After 4 consecutive days of grinding, high-casualty warfare in the intense summer heat, the structural fatigue of the Imperial army reached a critical threshold. The heavily encumbered regular troops were exhausted, their formations battered, and their supplies dwindling rapidly. By the end of the 4th day, the Romans had lost their momentum, and Khaled realized the moment had come to shift from defense to total annihilation. On the 5th day of the engagement, the operational tempo shifted decisively. Vahan, recognizing the severe structural degradation of his infantry blocks and the plummeting morale across the multi-ethnic Imperial camp, dispatched an envoy to the Rashidun lines to negotiate a temporary truce. The Roman High Command desperately required an operational pause to rest their heavily encumbered regular troops, treat the mounting casualties, and attempt to repair their fractured supply lines. Khaled ibn al-Walid fundamentally understood the strategic vulnerability this request exposed and immediately rejected the offer. Instead of granting the Romans a reprieve, the Rashidun commander seized the psychological initiative. He recognized that the Imperial army was effectively culminating, transitioning from an offensive posture into a static defensive formation. In response, Khaled stripped the scattered cavalry squadrons from his infantry wings and consolidated them into a single, massive strike force of approximately 8,000 riders. This reorganization completely altered his operational capability. He no longer intended to use his cavalry merely to plug defensive gaps, but to deliver a localized, decapitating blow to the Imperial command structure. Before launching this centralized offensive, however, Khaled executed a maneuver of logistical warfare that irrevocably sealed the fate of the Roman forces. The Imperial camp's primary defensive anchor, the sheer gorge of the Wadi al-Rukad, was entirely impassable for tens of thousands of retreating men and horses, save for one critical geographical choke point, the stone bridge at Ain al-Dakar. Under the cover of darkness, Khaled detached a specialized unit of his light cavalry to bypass the massive, static Roman flanks. The quiet, rapid movement of hooves over the arid terrain in the dead of night went entirely undetected by the exhausted Roman sentries who were focused on the front-line encampments. This detachment swiftly overpowered the garrison and seized the bridge, cleanly severing the only viable avenue of retreat connecting the Roman army to the Imperial road network and the safety of Damascus. The capture of the Ain al-Dakar bridge fundamentally inverted the strategic reality of the Yarmouk campaign. By securing this single vital piece of infrastructure, the very geography that Vahan had confidently chosen to protect his flanks was transformed into an inescapable snare. The Imperial army was no longer an attacking force dictating the terms of the war. In a matter of hours, their status had been reduced to that of a trapped garrison, pinned against a precipitous drop, and entirely cut off from the possibility of resupply or reinforcement. Khaled had successfully boxed in a coalition of up to 80,000 men, using a fraction of their numbers, ensuring that the coming battle would not end in a negotiated withdrawal, but in total eradication. Vahan awoke on the 6th day to find his massive command entirely surrounded, but the worst was yet to come, as the sky above the eastern plateau began to turn a bruised, ominous yellow. The ominous yellow sky that broke over the Yarmouk Valley on the morning of the 6th day heralded the arrival of the Khamsin, a violent and superheated south wind driving thick clouds of desert sand. In military engagements of antiquity, weather was rarely a neutral factor, but at Yarmouk, the compson functioned as a massive, asymmetrical tactical advantage. The wind blew directly into the faces of the Roman troops, while the Rashidun forces fought with it at their backs. For the Roman infantry, which relied entirely on visual cues like the raising of standards, the signals of officers, and the strict alignment of the shield wall, the loss of visibility was structurally fatal. Command signals were instantly swallowed by the storm. As the suffocating, abrasive heat of the airborne grit filled the lungs and eyes of the Imperial regular troops, their heavy chainmail and scaled armor transformed from life-saving protection into a stifling physical trap. On recognizing that the Imperial command structure was effectively paralyzed by the zero visibility conditions, Khaled ibn al-Walid immediately launched a general offensive across the entire front line. He did not aim for a prolonged engagement. His objective was to shatter the Roman formations before they could retreat or adapt. With the 8,000-strong unified cavalry reserve under his direct command, Khaled bypassed the hardened Roman center and drove a massive wedge directly into the Imperial left flank. The sudden, overwhelming concentration of cavalry shock tactics against a blinded infantry line caused an immediate structural failure. The Roman left, composed largely of allied infantry, already exhausted from 5 days of combat, buckled and then broke entirely. Stripped of their visual cohesion, those soldiers could not see their commanders or the men next to them, dissolving the complex military formations into isolated, panicked pockets of resistance. The collapse of the left flank precipitated a chain reaction that unraveled the entire Roman battle line. As Khaled's cavalry ruthlessly exploited the breach, they rolled up the Roman center from the side, severing the heavy infantry from their supporting Armenian and Ghassanid units. Vahan attempted to deploy his elite cataphracts to stabilize the collapsing line, but the heavy Roman cavalry, disoriented by the fierce headwinds and unable to mount a coordinated countercharge, were rapidly isolated and driven from the field. Their flight marked the definitive end of Roman operational capability at Yarmouk. Left without cavalry support and with their lines entirely disintegrated, the remaining tens of thousands of Roman infantry found themselves leaderless in the chaotic haze. The discipline that had held the empire together for centuries finally evaporated under the relentless tactical and psychological pressure. Stripped of their command hierarchy and battered by an enemy they could barely see, the surviving Imperial soldiers abandoned their positions and turned to flee toward what they believed was the safety of their camp and the Damascus road. They had no knowledge that the bridge at Ain al-Dakar had already fallen. Blinded, suffocating, and with their flanks collapsing, the Imperial army fell back into the exact geographical nightmare Khaled had prepared for them. As the Imperial lines dissolved under the cavalry assault, the retreat rapidly devolved into a logistical catastrophe. Then tens of thousands of regular infantry, stripped of their commanding officers and disoriented by the driving sand, surged westward toward the Wadi al-Rukad. In standard military withdrawals, a disciplined rear guard is deployed to absorb enemy pressure and buy time for the main body to navigate geographic choke points in an orderly fashion. At Yarmouk, however, command and control had completely evaporated. There was no coordinated rear guard, and the only viable choke point, the Ain al-Dakar bridge, was already heavily defended by Rashidun detachments. The massive, compressed columns of Roman soldiers were violently funneled toward the precipice, driven toward the edge not just by the pursuing Arab cavalry, but by the sheer crushing pressure of their own panicked ranks. All the orthodox tactical measures that had previously sustained the Imperial defensive lines now became mechanisms of mass execution. To enforce discipline and prevent desertion during the grueling multi-day engagement, several Roman and Allied infantry cohorts had chained themselves together in tight blocks of 10 to 30 men. While this method effectively maintained a rigid shield wall on a flat plateau, it proved fundamentally fatal in a blind, uncoordinated rout. As the soldiers nearest the ravine were forced backward by the surging crowd, they experienced the horrifying realization of empty air as they were pushed entirely over the unseen edge of the cliffs. Their heavy scale armor accelerated their plunge, inextricably dragging their tethered comrades down with them into the steep gorge. In these final hours, the engagement ceased to be a battle of martial skill and became an industrial-scale disaster dictated entirely by crowd mechanics and vertical terrain. The deep ravines of the Wadi al-Rukad functioned as an inescapable terminal point. Tens of thousands of Imperial troops perished not by direct combat, but by the plunging fall onto the volcanic rocks below, or by being suffocated beneath the immense cascading weight of their own collapsing formations. The destruction was absolute and unprecedented. Of the colossal coalition that Emperor Heraclius had bankrupted the state to assemble, an estimated 40,000 to 80,000 men were either killed or captured, representing the complete and irrecoverable eradication of the Eastern Roman field army. The veteran corps of the empire, the hardened infantrymen and heavy cavalry meant to secure the eastern frontier for a generation, had been wiped out in a single afternoon. The dust eventually settled over the Yarmouk Valley, revealing a silence that would reshape the balance of global power. News of the unprecedented disaster traveled north to the city of Antioch, where Emperor Heraclius had established his operational headquarters. The scale of the catastrophe was immediately clear. There were no reserve legions to summon, and the imperial treasury was entirely bankrupt. Recognizing that the military infrastructure of the Levant was irreparably broken, Heraclius made the agonizing decision to abandon the defense of the east and ordered a full withdrawal of the remaining imperial administration behind the Taurus Mountains, or as he departed for the safety of Constantinople. The exhausted emperor is recorded to have looked back toward the southern horizon and delivered his final political verdict. Farewell, a long farewell to Syria, my fair province. Thou art an infidel's now. This physical withdrawal of the emperor and his staff marked the definitive collapse of the Greco-Roman administrative apparatus that had governed the region for over 6 centuries. The strategic vacuum left by the annihilation of the imperial field army allowed the Rashidun Caliphate to rapidly consolidate their control over the Mediterranean coast. Without a centralized military force to relieve them, the remaining heavily fortified cities were isolated and systematically subdued. Damascus capitulated, followed by the surrender of Jerusalem in 637 CE, and within a decade, the immensely wealthy agricultural province of Egypt was permanently severed from Roman control. Stripped of its most lucrative territories and its primary grain supply, the Eastern Roman Empire was fundamentally transformed from a sprawling, multi-continental superpower into a beleaguered, highly militarized state, confined largely to the Anatolian Plateau and the Balkans. The Battle of Yarmouk was not merely a tactical defeat. It was the precise mechanism that extinguished classical antiquity in the Middle East and permanently redrew the religious, linguistic, and cultural map of the known world. This seismic shift in global power was orchestrated by the uncompromising strategic genius of Khaled ibn al-Walid. He proved that a smaller, highly mobile vanguard could dismantle an imperial juggernaut if it relentlessly exploited the enemy's divided command structure and weaponized the very geography the Romans believed would protect them. The violent dust of the Khamsin only finalized what rigid military hierarchy and the deep ravines had already begun. If you want to continue exploring the decisive command errors, the brutal terrain, and the brilliant tactics that forged the modern world, subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together.